Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to visit and to talk about this research as well as work on the project with you. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the project that I'm working on at the moment, Fair Shares and Families, which is about how children and their families think about, see and do kind of the sharing of resources within households. So I'll start off with just a bit of background of the project, then say a bit about the specific research questions and the methods, some of the challenges that we've had. The project's been active for a year now. It's a 2-year-long project, and we've had a few challenges along the way. And some emerging findings from the two strands of the project. There's an ethnographic strand and a survey strand. So findings from each of those. And the next steps that we're thinking about. And if anyone has any thoughts on where we can take the project next, I'd love to hear them. Oh, so in terms of the context of this project, as Peter mentioned, my background has been in studying child poverty and specifically children's own perspectives on their needs, both quantitative and qualitative. We know that child poverty is extremely important in children's lives. It's important to their well-being during childhood and to their well-becoming, to the adults that children grow up to become. And it's also a very important issue for the societies that children are a part of. It has detrimental effects not only for the people who experience it, but for societies as a whole. And there's been a lot of policy attention to child poverty at national and international levels. In the UK, in 1999, our then Prime Minister Tony Blair made a commitment to end child poverty within a generation. And that resulted in a lot of policy action, a lot of developments. And in 2010, the Child Poverty Act, which committed the government to legally binding targets of child poverty reduction. Progress towards those goals for over the next kind of 5 years was reasonable, but then a coalition government took over from the Labour government, and they've not quite succeeded in completely repealing the Child Poverty Act, despite having supported it when it was voted in, but they're making their best efforts to do that. They've removed the legally binding nature of the targets. They're debating the definitions of poverty, which are largely around income and material deprivation, and they're arguing that we should be looking at household worklessness, although studies tend to find that 2/3 of children in the UK who are in poverty are in households with at least one adult in paid work. They're wanting to focus on parental behaviours, things like addiction. So things that academics tend to not really agree are very good indicators of child poverty. So it's all a bit up in the air in the moment in terms of what the government is specifically wanting to do around that. The EU also, which we're not quite sure what the status of Britain is going to be over the next few years in relation to the European Union, but they have taken a lot of policy action in relation to child poverty as well. And the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, mention poverty specifically. In terms of why I'm particularly interested in looking at children's perspectives, there's 3 kind of reasons for this. Firstly, studies of intra-household allocation, which have mostly been done on a kind of gender basis. They've looked at sharing between heterosexual couples and how resources and money are shared out within households. And we know from those studies that family sharing practices are definitely not necessarily equitable, which is problematic when we're kind of used to using measures of household poverty based on household income, which fundamentally assume an equitable distribution of that income between members of the household. But we know that doesn't happen. We know that how money is spent and how different needs are prioritised varies depending on who receives payment. For example, we know that money paid to children's main carer, who tends to be the mother, tends to be spent on children and on the family, whereas money is paid to an adult who's not the children's main carer, tends to be spent on the person who receives the payment. The sociology of childhood, so a kind of shift over the past couple of decades from viewing children as adults in the making, so not particularly as of interest in their own right, but of interest in terms of the adults they're going to become, to viewing children's lives in the present as relevant and interesting to study. So looking at children not only as becomings, but also as beings who are relevant people here and now. And finally, children's rights. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child doesn't explicitly mention poverty, but it does in Article 27 talk about the right to an adequate standard of living. And I'm particularly interested as well in Article 12, children's rights to have a say in decisions affecting them. And the Convention actually positions this not only in relation to children as individuals, but in relation to children collectively. And child poverty, I would argue, is relevant both to children as individuals who experience poverty, but also relevant in kind of broader social terms in terms of what policies there are to address poverty and ameliorate experiences of poverty, and how it's defined and understood as well. In terms of some key findings from previous research that have informed how this project's been set up, so we know, for example, that if we talk to parents about the resources that their family has and how those are allocated, there's a lot of evidence that they make very strong attempts to protect children from exposure to poverty. They'll sacrifice their own needs in order to provide for their children. A particularly stark finding from the 2012 UK Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey, which I worked on, looking at parental sacrifice and child poverty within households where children are deprived and the household is on a low income. 69% of adults go without adequate food in order to ensure that the children have enough to eat. So we know that parents are making significant and very worrying sacrifices to provide for their children. And that's more strongly, the kind of burden of that sacrifice is more strongly borne by children's main carer, who again tends to be the woman in a household. In terms of looking at children's perspectives, there are many studies now that show us that children are active agents. They're not just passively experiencing poverty, they're very active in how they experience poverty and what they do to try to remedy that situation. So Tess Ridge from the University of Bath did a very important study with children in low-income families. The Children's Society in the UK are currently doing a longitudinal study where they're going back to children in low-income families over a few years to talk to them about how they're negotiating living in poverty. And also from my own PhD research, I found children were highly engaged with discussions about the nature of poverty. So this wasn't just with children in low-income households, this was with a fairly representative group of children from low-income to fairly high-income households. And they were very much engaged with discussions of what poverty is, what we mean by it, what you need to avoid it, whether we should understand it as something that's relative to the society that they're in or absolute. And they were very keen to discuss those kinds of topics. And finally, child poverty and subjective well-being, and this is another kind of strand of the project really, is looking into the links between the two, because one kind of persistent finding in research looking at poverty and subjective well-being among children is that there's a real mismatch between qualitative findings, where children are telling us that it makes them really miserable to be in poverty. There's all kinds of stigma and shame involved in it, and going with that has a really detrimental impact on their lives. But quantitative studies of child poverty, mostly drawing on household income, but also drawing on parental reports of whether children have access to resources that parents deem necessary for children, tend to find very little or no significant association between the two. So there's a real mismatch there between what qualitative studies have been showing and what quantitative studies have been showing. Again, in my PhD research, I was developing a measure of child deprivation based on children's own perspectives on their needs. And that measure has been tested in a few surveys now and repeatedly shows a much stronger association than household income. But I think there's a lot more to the story than that. I think there's a lot more to be found, and hopefully some of the results I'll be talking about today will begin to illuminate that a bit. So, in terms of the research questions and methods, the project's funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council, and the three kind of overarching topics that we're looking at are how children understand and contribute to resource and financial decision making in their families, how families' socio-economic status relates to resource allocation patterns and practices. And that one I'm very much looking at because the kind of policy rhetoric and the media rhetoric in the UK around poverty is very much, it's a product of mismanagement of finances by parents. That parents aren't really, if they would just manage their money a bit better and work a bit harder, then they wouldn't be in poverty, which of course assumes that poor families are doing things differently to other families. But that's not really been tested. A lot of the studies have just looked at children in low-income families. So what I'm trying to do here is test whether actually they do things differently to other families, or whether they're just doing things in more constrained circumstances. And finally, how different patterns of resource allocation relate to child subjective well-being. Now, I'm not going to answer all of those questions today, and I might not manage to answer any of them. We still haven't got most of the data for the project yet, but we have got some of the data, so I'll be saying a little bit about very early thoughts in relation to those. In terms of the methodology, it's a mixed methods project. I have a wonderful research fellow who's been doing a 9-month ethnographic study with 10 families in Leeds and in York in the UK. Leeds is a big multicultural city in the north of the UK. York is a much smaller, much less diverse city also in the north of the UK. So we're looking at families in both of those contexts. And a panel survey which has 3 waves. I'm going to be presenting some data on the first wave, which is the only one that's actually been completed so far. The next is due to go in the field probably mid-November. So I'm working at the moment on analysing what we've got from the first wave and from the ethnography to figure out what we need to be asking in the next wave of the survey, which questions we should repeat, which we should change, and so on. And we're trying to kind of have an iterative process between these different strands, so allowing findings from the ethnographic strand to help us develop or work out what kind of topics to look at in the survey strand, and also looking at findings from the survey strand and taking questions that raises for us back to the families who are participating in the ethnography, which isn't to say that we're expecting findings to be completely complementary. I think that would be unlikely, but just so we can kind of investigate findings from each strand using the other. So in terms of gendered studies of intra-household allocation, they've tended to look at processes, so how are decisions made and who's involved in making decisions about resource allocation, and outcomes, so fundamentally who gets what, and are those outcomes equitable. And we've also gradually kind of moved towards looking at awareness, so how aware are children of family financial matters? Assumptions tend to be that children aren't particularly aware, and parents try to protect children not only from exposure to poverty, but from a knowledge of what's going on in family financial matters. But also, are parents aware of children's activities, roles and views? So we are interested in actually whether children are doing things that parents aren't necessarily aware of and can't necessarily report on. And we're going to children aged, sorry, I should have said before, this is with children aged 10 to 17. And power as well, who has control over decisions when and how. So if children are involved in the processes of decision making, is that kind of seen as their right, or is it something that parents kind of invite them to participate in it sometimes and not at other times? And what kind of characteristics affect differences in power? Again, I don't have firm answers to any of these questions today, very early on in the project and so on, but these are the kind of issues that we're interested in unpacking a bit. So some of the challenges that we've had so far with the ethnographic strand, and I'm sure this will be familiar to anyone who's done any kind of qualitative research, meeting our sample targets and recruitment has been very difficult, and we're asking a lot of families. We're asking to come in and talk to them about how they manage their money and their finances. In the UK, this is kind of notoriously a topic that people want to be very private about. You don't want to discuss your income with other people. We've even had some families where there are 2 adult partners who aren't aware of each other's income and keep that kind of private from each other. So we're asking a huge amount of these families, and understandably, it's been quite difficult. We have got a reasonably diverse sample now, and we've got some really interesting findings from that, but it took a long time to get there. The balance between individual perspectives and comparative data, of course, it's a very broad topic. If we go into a family and say we want to talk about how you share your resources, how different families even interpret that question is very varied. And that's raised some really interesting and unexpected avenues that we'd like to pursue. So there's a kind of tension between going down these different avenues that open up across families, but also generating enough data that we can come up with, for example, topics that we need to pursue in the survey strand and things that we can compare about the different families. And developing suitable tools to use with children, parents and families. And I have to say again, my research fellow has done all of the ethnographic field work, and she's developed some fantastic and very creative tools to use with families. So some a game that she's used with them, and kind of exercise where they've been building pyramids based on needs and how decisions are made. And I'm very much going to be encouraging her to write a paper about that. She's a Susana Cortes Morales, so if you are interested, then do look out for the paper that she's going to be writing on the methods that she's been using with that as well. In terms of the survey strand, so finding and devising questions on topics arising from the ethnography. So we'll quite often in the ethnography get an idea that this is a really interesting topic to pursue, but then figuring out how to pursue that, how to write survey questions based on the kind of topics we're getting in the ethnography has been very challenging as a process. The survey is with 1,000 parent-child pairs, and figuring out, we had quite a developed sampling strategy for the child participants. We wanted that to be fairly equally balanced or representatively balanced across socioeconomic groups and in terms of gender and age. But figuring out which parent, if the child is living in a context of two parents, which household, if the child is living across multiple households. In the end, the survey agency told us they couldn't really do anything about that anyway. If we wanted to sample based on child characteristics, then it would have to be done based on that and whichever parent was able to participate. But that, as a result of that, the data that we've got from parents isn't representative of the parents of these children. It's very much a self-selected sample. We did some detailed trialling and cognitive testing with the survey to make sure, and we were actually quite surprised at the range of questions that children as young as 10 did really engage with. I mean, we wrote the survey and then thought that we would have to make quite substantial changes, but actually children were understood a lot more than we gave them credit for, really. And finally, the reason for the delay in the survey strand going into the field was Brexit in 2015, the referendum for where the other people in my country, not including me, voted to leave the European Union. And then Theresa May, our current Prime Minister, took over as Prime Minister, saying that she definitely wasn't going to declare a general election, that the public had voted and this was what was going to happen. And then she declared a general election on the same day that the survey was due to go in the field. So the survey agency got in touch and said, well, sorry, but this just definitely isn't going to happen for another couple of weeks, because they, of course, had to do a lot of work around the general election and polling for that. So Theresa May delayed my project. So some emerging findings from the ethnographic strand, and these are very much in progress. We've finished the first kind of set of data collection for this, but because Susanna's time on the project was quite limited, she's mostly been focusing on fieldwork, and we're just now kind of going over the data and starting to come up with some themes from it. But firstly, something that was really clear throughout is that perceived fairness of how resources are shared is really, really important to children and families. It's something that all of the families are really engaged with. They really want to do things fairly. How they define fairness varies not only between families, but between members of the same family. And it's a very complex topic for families, but there's a real commitment in all of the families who are participating to do things fairly. Perceptions of who is family and who contributes to family resources is really diverse. And we deliberately, when I was writing the proposal for this project, I was talking about family rather than household, because increasingly more children live across multiple households. Studies based on households tend to just look at the resource of one of those households that the child belongs to, which assumes firstly that it's easy to allocate a child to a single household, and secondly that that child's material well-being is entirely determined by that household. And we know for children living in multiple households that just isn't going to be the case. They'll carry resources between households. One household that they live in might be significantly better off than another household that they live in. And so I'm not claiming that we're going to be able to capture all of that complexity at all, but we wanted to look beyond the household and to how children think about and go about acquiring resources from people who they consider to be family rather than just who they live with. One example of the kind of diversity is one boy who talked about when we were asking, like, so who would you go to if you needed something? And the person he'd go to was his mum's ex-boyfriend who had split up from his mum several years earlier. Not somebody who was going to be captured in any kind of measure of who is part of your household, and probably not even who's part of your family. But for that boy, he was a key person to go to, and they've maintained a strong relationship. For that boy, he was family, but that's not going to be captured in kind of traditional ways of measuring. Having a degree of autonomy in how they get hold of and use resources was incredibly important to children. As I said before, here we were mainly focused on children aged 10 to 16, but of course we were going into families where there were younger siblings as well. And my favourite example for this was a 4-year-old girl in one of the families who her teddy, her stuffed toy, had been torn. And her older brother and her mum and her dad were talking about how they would go about fixing it. And she ran out of the room and started shouting at them. So Susanna asked her later, so are you okay? So what was that about? And she was saying, well, they were just all making the decision for me. They were saying what we should do with my toy, and I want to decide that it's mine. So even among very young children, this kind of having some autonomy over how their resources are treated and what happens with their things was really important. Children had various and very diverse strategies used to acquire money and other resources. So a lot of children talked about work, and a lot of the kinds of work that they talked about wouldn't be picked up on if we were just looking at labour market kinds of work. They would talk about doing jobs for their family, doing jobs for people in their local neighbourhood, as well as formal kinds of work. Negotiations with parents and siblings. So we had a couple of sets of twins in the Ethnographic Strand. One who were a bit younger, they were 11, they would very much pool all of their resources and quite deliberately would become interested in similar things and want similar things so that they could pool their resources. The other set of twins who were 16 talked about how they used to do that when they were younger, but as they got older, they'd quite deliberately, again, diversified their interests. It was important for them at that age to be quite different to each other. So the kind of negotiation between them changed a lot over time. Monetary gifts and rewards. There was quite a, particularly among better off families, a recognised market in doing well in your school exams. There was a particular rate that children expected their parents to pay them, depending on what grade they got in exams. And the existence of kind of peers who didn't get paid for exam results was something to be talked about. They all knew who wasn't getting paid for their results in exams. And that was, yeah, something that was hot gossip. And structural barriers to acquiring resources were also really important. So there was a lot of anger around the minimum age for paid work. Young people in the UK can't engage in any kind of paid work, and other than very exceptional circumstances, under the age of 13. And we had a few very, very angry 12-year-olds who really wanted a job but weren't allowed to get one. And minimum wage legislation as well in the UK, it's inequitable once you are officially an adult as well. There's a lower rate for 16-year-olds, for 18-year-olds, and for 21-year-olds. There's a lower rate of housing benefit in the UK up to the age of 35. But young people who were aged between 13 and 16 would be very annoyed that they were doing exactly the same job as somebody next to them who happened to be 10 years older, and there was literally no minimum wage that they were entitled to. They got what they were given, and it was usually significantly less than their colleagues were getting. We found that families were really interested in talking about their family sharing practices, but that often the kind of practices were invisible until we talked to them about them. So one of the things that we found with most of the families was that they were really interested in the study and kind of wanted to take part in it, partly because they didn't know what they did and they wanted to kind of find out what they did. And a really nice example of this, nice is maybe the wrong word, is childcare. What we found almost universally was that the woman was responsible for paying for childcare out of her money. And that hadn't crossed their minds at all as something that might be inequitable. You know, this in couple families as well as in separated families. The woman was expected out of her budget to cover the costs of childcare, and it hadn't even occurred to most women that this was something that actually was a responsibility of both parents rather than just of her. Similar topics had very different meanings for different families. So pocket money was something that came up quite a lot. And in some families that was because, well, parents felt awful that they couldn't give their children any money. It was just not possible within the kind of budget they had. In other families, it was very much about autonomy. It was about giving children some kind of choice over some portion of the resources that they got. And in other families, it was very much a developmental tool. It was kind of pedagogical device to teach children about money management. And whilst that might have given children some autonomy, the parents' purpose in doing that was very much so that they would learn to manage a budget later on rather than anything to do with them in their day-to-day lives. Family histories as well. Almost all of the families had a strong narrative of having kind of the parents telling their children that they had come from less than they had now, that they'd kind of worked up to where they are now. But what that meant varied a lot. So among richer families, what it tended to mean was that after finishing university and potentially postgraduate qualifications, their parents gave them enough money to put a deposit on a house, but the mortgage was so big that they were spending most of their disposable income on housing costs. What it meant to poorer families was something very different to that. It was coming from nothing, literally. And class was something that middle-class families talked a lot about as well. As I said before, the kind of sharing practices were often invisible, but when Susanna was asking questions around, so how did you decide to do it that way? What kind of influenced your decision to do it that way? A lot of parents would say, well, this is what middle-class families do. And that wasn't something that working-class families said at all. There was no sense among them that this was a classed part of their identity. And even when we didn't see a particular difference in how they were doing it, middle-class families would still explain it as, that's why we do it. And competing definitions of fairness, particularly in relation to, in the final visit to some of the families, Susanna was asking them how they would allocate resources more theoretically. So questions like, imagine that you've got this amount of money and you're responsible for ensuring that everyone's okay. How would you share that money out? And children tended to talk a lot more about equality, about sharing the money out equally between people. And we had, in 2 of the families at least, one of the parents got quite annoyed about that because that was promoting communism, and they kind of shouted the child down for promoting communism in response to that kind of question, which I thought was really interesting. Definitions of who deserves what and how we find out who deserves what. So again, children engaging very much with the kind of discussions and debates that adults have around these issues. We didn't notice children not being aware of these questions, not engaging with them. They talked about these kinds of issues in similar ways to how adults do. And temporality as well, in terms of what they have now compared to what parents had when they were a similar age, what they've got now compared to siblings, and what's normal now. So one example of this was there was a 13-year-old girl whose 18-year-old brother was also talking to us as part of the study. Again, he was outside the age range, but because he was a sibling, we included him. And she really wanted an iPhone. And her mum was saying, well, no, you can't have one because your brother got one when he was 15, so you'll get one when you're 15. And she was saying, yes, but he was 15 however many years ago, and that was before everyone had one. So the kind of change in social norms over time were of key importance to the daughter, but the parent didn't see it in the same way. So moving on to some initial findings from the first wave of the survey strand. In a kind of overview of what we found with the survey, we found that a wide range of questions that I mentioned before were comprehensible to children and really interesting to children. We did quite a lot of cognitive testing, and children reported really enjoying taking part in it. They liked being asked about these kinds of things, and it wasn't the kind of topic that they were used to being asked about. And that was reflected as well in the main survey, where we have very low rates of missing data. Children did provide responses to all of these questions, and very few of them were kind of don't know, don't want to say kinds of responses. So although we don't know exactly what that means, it's hopefully some kind of sign that children were quite engaged with the topics we were asking them about. And testing of adult questions with children as well. So I took quite a lot of questions from other surveys and adapted them. Questions around constraint, subjective poverty, access to financial resources, intra-household sharing, and how children contribute to household economies. And again, children were very engaged with these, and through the cognitive testing had a pretty good understanding of the kinds of things we were getting at. Just a few descriptive findings first. So in terms of child deprivation, we used the child deprivation scale, which was the instrument that I developed for my PhD research, based on 10 items that children themselves had identified as important for their material well-being. And we found that nearly 22% of children lacked 2 or more items, and 6.9% lacked 5 or more, and they're the thresholds that I've used most of the time to kind of determine being deprived and severely deprived. And that's quite similar to what we found in other surveys in terms of the proportions. The child deprivation scale was significantly correlated with household income and with subjective well-being, nowhere near a kind of identical measure though, which is what we'd expect again based on overlaps in terms of poverty. We wouldn't expect deprivation and income to identify the same people. Household income was only very weakly correlated with subjective well-being, but it was a significant association, and again that mirrors what we'd expect based on previous research. In terms of economic constraint, nearly 34% of children reported that a lack of money had stopped them doing something that they wanted to do, sometimes or often, and 6.3% said that that happened to them often. Nearly half of all of the children reported that a lack of money had stopped them getting something they wanted sometimes or often, and 9.4% said often. And nearly 27% said that they felt embarrassed due to a lack of money sometimes, with 5% saying that they did that often. And I think this is probably the most worrying one here. I mean, getting something you want, most people will be used to that not happening all the time, but feeling shamed as a result of experiences of poverty. We've got 27% of children reporting that. And all of those measures were significantly associated with lower household income and higher deprivation. And children's roles in household economies, what children do to contribute to and to consume the resource of households. So we found, as I mentioned before, it's a consistent finding that parents try to protect children. We also found that children try to protect parents. Nearly a quarter of children reported pretending that they didn't want something to avoid putting pressure on household budgets and causing stress to parents. 10% of children reported that they got a job to earn money for themselves, which again kind of takes some of that burden off the household budget if the child's earning their own income. And nearly 2% reported getting a job so that they could contribute to their family's economic situation. Stealing. I was quite surprised. I put the questions in because it was something that came out of the ethnographic research. I didn't think we'd actually get many answers to this, but we did. Almost all of the children did complete the question, and we had nearly 2% reporting shoplifting for themselves, 1.5% shoplifting for things that other family members needed, and 3.2% stealing from other members of their household in order to get what they needed. 15% reported using old or worn out things in order to to not request getting something new. And informal labour, so contributions to household tasks. We asked about a whole range of different tasks that children might do: cleaning, laundry, washing up, food preparation, caring for siblings, caring for other family or household members. And most children did some household tasks, but what we found was that other than one item in a list of 20, which was cleaning the car, significantly more was done by girls than by boys, even at age 10. So these kind of reproductions of not valuing women's work are being transmitted to even 10-year-olds. So this is a very, very early effort at looking at the links between household income deprivation, subjective material well-being, and overall subjective well-being. I did this on the plane on the way over, so please don't take any of it as final yet. It's all very much a work in progress. But I was trying to test a few hypotheses based on previous research. So those were that child-derived deprivation indicators would have a stronger association with subjective well-being than household income. That's been tested several times. I was pretty confident that one would work out. Subjective material well-being will mediate the relationship between objective material well-being and subjective well-being. And that's something that's come up quite a lot in studies where subjective indicators have been used, and it's been kind of used to justify claims that certain kinds of disadvantage are more important than poverty. And my kind of theory is much more that, well, we ask similar, subjective indicators are always going to correlate more strongly with other subjective indicators than objective indicators are. So what I'm saying here is that the association between low income and deprivation to subjective well-being will be mediated by subjective material well-being. And finally, the perceptions of how families share resources will mediate the relationship between objective material well-being and subjective material well-being. I'm going to show you what questions I used for all of those next. And findings so far looking at this kind of topic have tended to use linear regression modelling. So what I wanted to do was compare how that kind of approach worked against a structural equation modelling approach, where you can much more overtly look at mediation effects and path analysis. So in terms of the predictors, had household income, which was reported by parents, and that's in thousands of pounds. Child deprivation, which was reported by the child using the child deprivation scale. 2 questions on perceptions of fairness of family resource sharing reported by children. And by the way, I'm not claiming that this is anything like a full measure of resource sharing. This is very much children's subjective reports on how fair they perceive it to be. So one of those was children's agreement with the statement that in my family, everyone gets a say in how we use our money and things. And the second one, in our family, everyone gets a fair share of the money and things that we've got. And subjective material well-being, which was 3 indicators: the wealth of the family compared to other families that the child knows, how the child's personal access to resources compared to other young people they know, and how happy they are with the things they have. So what I did to compare the 2 kinds of model was standardise all of these, and then for the linear model, the linear regression model, sum the standardised indicators where there are multiple indicators to generate a single variable. But I used a latent variable approach in the structural equation model, so I put the indicators in as predictors with error terms. And the outcome was the student's life satisfaction scale. There's been a modified version of that. It's usually 7 items. It's been modified to be 5 items, and that's been tested a few times by Gwyther-Rees in Wales. And the 5-item index tends to work as well as 7-item index, so I saved space by having just the 5 items. And this is all controlled for age and gender. So this is the linear regression results. Very much what we'd expect and very similar to previous studies. The child deprivation scale has relatively strong and highly significant results. Subjective material well-being has the same. Perceived fairness of how families share their resources is significant, and child's age is significant. And here's the structural equation model. which does show a slightly more complicated picture. I'll show you this, but I'll move on to showing you the, I've got a table of the direct, indirect, and total effects, which is probably a bit easier to read. So basically I had income and deprivation as measured variables, subjective material well-being, family sharing, and subjective well-being as latent variables. And the model has pretty good fit within the kind of usual parameters. So in terms of the effects, this shows all of them, but I'll particularly draw your attention to these. So in terms of direct effects, income and the child deprivation scale have completely counterintuitive findings in terms of their direct effects. The higher the income, directly related to subjective well-being when the other factors are controlled for, the lower the subjective well-being, and the lower the deprivation scale, the higher the subjective well-being, which is completely counterintuitive, but that's controlling for family sharing and subjective well-being. But the overall, the total effects are the way around we'd expect. So what I would say that possibly indicates is that in the absence of perceived fairness in how families share resources and satisfaction with their material well-being, higher income and deprivation don't improve subjective well-being. You need also to feel that the resources are shared fairly and that you are satisfied with things you have. So family sharing was significant and quite a strong predictor, and subjective material well-being as well was a significant predictor of overall subjective well-being. So in terms of the three hypotheses, so child-derived deprivation indicates had a stronger association than household income. Yes, that is consistent with what we found. Subjective material well-being did mediate the relationship between objective material well-being and subjective well-being, and perceptions of how families shared their resources did mediate the relationship between objective and subjective material well-being. One of the things that I was quite pleased with, although obviously you shouldn't go into statistical analysis with an agenda, but was that income did still have a role to play. Income was significant in the model. In the linear regression model, it didn't have a significant association with subjective well-being, but it was a significant predictor of higher subjective material well-being. So it did influence through that pathway. And so this kind of indicates that perhaps income has a bit more of a role to play in children's subjective well-being than previous studies have indicated, although the association is very complex. And that children's reports on their objective and subjective situations are important. We can learn more from children's reports than from a reliance on kind of household-based measures of child poverty. So some very early conclusions and implications. The black box of the household economy, we've known for a long time it's very problematic in terms of gender. It's also problematic in terms of comparing children's and adult situations, and that investigating both of those is not kind of investigating children at the expense of women. What's very likely to be the case is that investigating children will kind of be complementary with investigating women's experiences of poverty within households. Household income is still important. It's important to objective well-being, that's very well established, but it's also potentially more important to subjective well-being than we had previously thought. And many children have a good awareness of their family's material situation, despite attempts of parents to protect them from that. And parents might not be aware of the extent of their children's awareness. Children are trying to hide things from parents to reduce stress on parents, just as parents are trying to hide things from children to reduce stress felt by children. And considering both accounts perhaps just gives us a bit more of a nuanced picture of the effects of poverty on children and families. In terms of the next steps, I was delighted to hear from Susanna that she's from Chile, and she's won a bursary from the Chilean government to keep working on the study for another year as a postdoctoral position. I feel a bit bad about poverty research in the UK being funded by the Chilean government, but they kind of looked at it in terms of her career development and an opportunity for her to kind of take this knowledge back once she's finished and hopefully do some similar research there. But we're thinking about trying to get into some more lower income families in the ethnographic strand of the study, look for a bit more ethnic diversity, and look in a bit more depth at children's and young people's autonomy, the processes, and kind of how power relates to the processes of making decisions. Finally, this is my very last point, the second wave of the survey is going to go into the field soon, as I mentioned before. So we've got a lot of decisions to make about which questions to repeat, what kind of new topics and questions to pursue. Some of the ideas for new topics that we have are attitudes towards children's involvement. So parental attitudes. Are parents involving children? What's their rationale for involving children? And are they more inclined to try to protect children or to expose children to that, probably based on ethnographic findings, as a pedagogical kind of tool. And the rationale for involving children, as I was just saying, really. So is that about educating children in financial literacy? Is it about giving them some autonomy? Or in some families, we've had some indications that it might be an inevitability, particularly where the young person is a carer for a disabled household member. The family may simply have no choice but to involve the child more than they might otherwise in a lot of the household finances. So thank you very much for listening.